Welcome to this webisode. Yesterday I told you to conclude my conference that not all can be hermits of the Laura tradition. Not all can be monks of the Cenobite tradition, but all should be hermits, all should be monks at heart, inside, seeking God and His kingdom. And as I told you yesterday, this should be one of the best fruits of this COVID-19 quarantine and lockdown measure. Today I would like to bring you to the consideration of the monastic habit, the habit that a monk wears. While it has been said that the habit does not make the monk, meaning the external garment that he wears, the external garb that he wears, does not make the monk. I remember a story about a young novice who, during the first months of his novitiate after the investiture with the monastic garb, he would even go out to the fields to work with his habit on. Of course, in the beginnings of the monastic life, that was their practice, but not so anymore today. So this young novice would go out to the field and work with his habit on, and his novice master tolerated him. Maybe it was his way of testing whether this young novice had understood the meaning of the habit with which he was invested some months ago. And he would do that on, only to end up after several months in the novitiate, he left. So I really wonder whether this young novice understood the meaning of the habit with which was invested sometime way back. Now, what are the elements of the monastic garb? First, you have the tunic, the sutana. But the sutana is more for the clergy. The diocesan priest or the religious priest. But the tunic is more for monks. And this tunic is laid in place by a cincture or a belt. Now, on top of the tunic is a scapular, which runs from the shoulder down to the ankles, and with a hood as covering of the head when the monk moves around, especially when it is very hot or it is raining. So these are the basic elements of the monastic garb. But in earlier times, right at the beginning of monasticism down there in the deserts of Egypt, there was no distinctive garb of the desert fathers. Well, I told you yesterday that the desert fathers were not priests, but plain laymen. They were called fathers because of their expertise in the labyrinthine way towards God. And along that way, they guided their disciples. Later, they simply assumed a distinctive garment reminiscent of the vesture of the prophet Elijah. You'll recall the story of the prophet Elijah in the second book of Kings. And reminiscent of John the Baptist. Then much later after that, it was the custom to receive the monastic garb from the spiritual father, from the Abbot of the desert tradition. So, a monk would receive the habit from the Abbot, to whose direction he has submitted himself during the period of apprenticeship. Now, Saint Benedict, for instance, received the monastic garb at the beginning of his eremitical life at the cave of Subiaco, and he received it from the monk Romanus. It was called then Habitus Sanctae Conversationis. Habitus is the Latin word for habit, Sanctae, holy, Conversationis, monastic way of life. So the habit that Benedict received from the monk Romanus was called the habit of holy monastic living. So it did not refer so much to that garment, external garment, as to the interior of the monk who is determined to live along the way of holy monastic life. So that's the habit. By the way, this conversationis, sanctae conversationis, another word for is holy stability. That the monk who received the habit interiorly made that promise with a determination to live in stability. And in Cenobitic monasteries, the monks living together in community, the habit was conferred by the abbot upon the new recruits. So that's a brief story of the habit. It's very important to remember it's called habitus sanctae conversationis. It's the habit of holy stability. Now, originally, the first element of the monastic garb was called the melota. Melota, M-E-L-O-T-A, which is the tunic. But originally, this melota was made of skin of an animal held in place with a leather cincture. I do not know how it feels to wear over the body the skin of an animal, like what John the Baptist wore and what Elijah wore. Then later, this melota, this animal skin worn over the body, held in place by a leather cincture, was replaced by the tunic. And then there was also a kind of a mantle over it. And then later on, the scapular was added. It's a strap of cloth worn over the shoulders to protect the tunic during work. So it's a kind of an apron then. Then the cuculla, the hood, was worn to cover the head. So that's monastic habit, how it developed. But more important than the external garment, the garb, is the meaning, the world of meaning. And this is more important. The monastic garb belongs to the world of what is called mystagogy. There is something external, it symbolizes something that is internal, and that internal symbolic of the monastic garb cannot be seen, but it has to be developed interiorly. What was the meaning given to the melota, which later on became the tunic of the monk? It has three meanings, three. The first is, it is prophetic. The prophetic character of the monastic life in the tradition of Elijah and John the Baptist. A prophet is someone who is sent by God to bring his people, his word to people. And therefore, this belongs to the charismatic order and not to the hierarchical order. So that's the first meaning of the melota, the tunic, or the sotana of the priest now. The second meaning of this melota is a reminder of the sin of Adam and Eve, which postulated the need for clothing and therefore the consequent conversion. See the element of the tunic, therefore? I really wonder whether this young novice I related at the beginning understood that. Most likely not, because he was converted back to the world from which he came. And the third meaning of the melota, the tunic, is It is symbolic of poverty, together with its call of renunciation and asceticism. So that's the melota. You know how really beautiful this world of meaning given to the monastic garb. And really the melota, the tunic, is meant to lead the monk, the one who wears it, to the habit of holy stability. Now let's take a look at the meaning of the tunic. Well, this is the symbolic meaning in monasticism. But the tunic in Scripture is the garment of the soldier of Christ. St. Paul calls the Christian a soldier of Christ. You find that in the second letter of St. Paul to Timothy, chapter 2, verse 3. So the tunic, the sotana, symbolizes our being a soldier of Christ. And as a soldier, he puts on the armor of God, the armor of God, the breastplate of justice, the shield of the Spirit, and the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit as he wages against the evil one in a spiritual warfare. So the tunic symbolizes battle, fight. And we have to be armed, we have to be clothed with such things as armor, breastplate, shield, sword, as we engage ourselves in a spiritual battle. Cassian, one of the authorities on monasticism, describes the monk as one enlisted in the army of Christ. Who engages himself in a spiritual battle and arms himself with the weapons of prayer, fasting, and vigils. Oh, the whole night is not meant for sleeping only, but part of the night should be spent in vigils. And the monks' battle, warfare, is conceived as a combat against demons and vices. In the rule of Saint Benedict, the military terminology is extended to the sense of service. Remember? Benedict says in the prologue, the monk is called unto the school of the Lord's service. And the enemy is one's self-will. And the service of Christ consists in obedience to the rule and to the Abbot. So that's the meaning of the tunic, therefore. Now, how about that pallium worn over the tunic on top of the shoulders? This is like a cloak, a mantle over the shoulders. Originally, the pallium was worn by philosophers. Monks adopted this pallium because it was believed that the monastic life was a true philosophy. A love for the wisdom way of life. Although the monks themselves never enrolled in a school with a philosophy department. So therefore, the meaning of the pallium is the monastic life is a wisdom way of life. And it is hoped through the years of stability in the monastery that the monk will become a wise man. Wise not in the understanding of the world, but in the understanding of God. Now, how about the scapular, that apron-like piece of cloth worn over the tunic? Well, this stands for the asceticism of work, particularly manual work. Well, it's ironical, it's contradictory. It is inconsistent for a monk who wears that and is lazy to work, lazy for manual work, and comes to say, oh, I can't make it. So the scapular then stands for the asceticism of work. Remember when I presented to you the meaning of work? One of the meaning of work for the monks is asceticism. It's an exercise, it's a discipline. The scapular also symbolizes the wearing of the cross, or the bearing of the cross rather, which demands the ascetical program of crucifixion and mortification of the monks' passions, of the monks' worldly desires, of the monks' worldly ambitions. And as such, as symbolic of the bearing of the cross, it entails great patience. By the way, patience comes from the Latin word pati, P-A-T-I, which means to suffer. So it entails patience, that is to say, to suffer and share in the passion of Christ. To bear even wrongs done to oneself. Yeah, you'll find this in the prologue of the Rule of Saint Benedict. And to hold fast to patience even in the midst of difficulties, contradictions, and even injustices. You find it in the Rule, chapter 7. Oh, how can a monk complain of pressures if he understands the meaning of that scapular? Over and above all, the scapular symbolizes the persevering efforts in the monastery until death. You'll find this in the prologue of the Rule of Saint Benedict. So those are some of the meanings, therefore, of the scapulars. It stands for the discipline of work. It stands for the bearing of the cross of Christ, which entails patience, even in the midst of difficulties, trials, problems, and even injustices done to the monk himself. And finally, it stands for perseverance until the end, until death. Now, how about the cincture? Originally, it was a leather belt. And this stands for chastity of the body. Now, this chastity of the body is an overflow of the monastic purity of heart, purity of one's inner depths. And it is kept and maintained by mortification, the tightening of one's belt, so to speak. And finally, how about the hood, the cuculla? It was called C-U-L-L-A, cuculla hood. Cuculla symbolizes the new life of grace. The cuculla, the hood, is compared to the baptismal robe. Well, and today, for baptisms of infants, they don't dress anymore the infant with that robe, baptismal robe. I remember my mother kept that little robe I used when I was baptized on an April 19, 1939. Now, it not only covers the head to protect it from heat or rains, but it also serves to control one's direction. If you would go to Bigan City, one of the 7 wonder cities of the world, and you ride on a kalesa, you will notice that the horse had some kind of, covering of the eyes, left and right. Because without that covering of the eyes of the horse will just run to any direction. There would be no straight path, no straight direction. So the hood, the cuculla, serves to control one's direction, to make straight one's path, and to ward off crossroads of tangency. Hence, it fosters one-minded, one-hearted, and one-handed direction of the monk's life. Okay, so these are the monastic garb elements and their symbolism. But let us zero into the essentials. To put on the monastic habit with its varied components means 4 essential elements. First, to strip oneself of the secular clothing. It means laying aside the monk's whole previous way of life and fleeing the sinful world with all its allurements. It's contradictory. For someone who wears the monastic garb and says he wants to go back to the world, it's contradictory, to say the least. And to say the worst, it's hypocritical. Cassian says, the stripping oneself of the secular clothing signifies not only the loss of all the monk's former possessions, but also that he has abandoned all worldly pride and become subject to the destitution and poverty of Christ. Cannot be. Otherwise, as I said, it's hypocrisy, plain hypocrisy. Second essential. So the first is to strip oneself of the secular clothing with all that what it entails. The second is to put on the new man who has been created according to God in the spirit of justice and holiness of truth. Now this is from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians chapter 4, verse 24. To put on the new man. I recall what the Abbot General of the Trappist said when he visited the Trappist monastery in Jordan, Guimaras. I was still there when the Abbot General visited the monastery. Well, he was an Englishman, very tall, 6'2". And he said, well, the problem of the monk is he has succeeded to put off the old man, but puts on the old woman, which is worse. So to put on the new man, in other words, to live a totally different way of life from what one has been accustomed to live while he was still in the world. The third essential, the habit, the monastic garb that the monk wears, puts on, is to proclaim his intention to live for God alone. To devote himself exclusively to God. And to consecrate his life to prayer. So it's a kind of a proclamation then. Proclamation of that intention to live for God alone. Soli Deo. Not to live for your Abbot. No, for God alone. To devote yourself exclusively to God and to consecrate your life to prayer. And the fourth essential is to give testimony and witness to the truth that the new life will be one of harsh combat against the flesh and the demons before he can ascend the heights of contemplation and union with God. It's to give a testimony and witness that the new life, meaning putting on the new man, created in the image and likeness of God, will be one of harsh combat against the flesh and the demons before the monk can ascend the heights of contemplation and come to a union with God. So these are the four essentials. First, to strip oneself of the secular clothing, meaning the previous way of life he has been accustomed to, and fleeing from the world. So isn't it inconsistent when a monk says he wants to return to the world? To put on the new man created in the image and likeness of God, and to proclaim his intention. In philosophy, I learned primum in intentione, ultimum in executione. First in the intention, but last in the execution. The intention to live for God alone and to devote oneself exclusively to God and to consecrate one's life to prayer. This is just the intention of the investiture of the habit, but one has to go through it, through life, and to give testimony and witness that the new life the monk has embarked on will not be an easy life. It will entail the rough and tough. Yes, it will be a bed of roses, but with thorns, plenty of thorns. Now let me give some implications for you and for your life and for yourself. Try to draw the implications for you of the monastic garb that monks wear. You are not going to wear a tunic as you go around, nor a scapular over your tunic, the scapular with a hood or with a pallium over your shoulders. No. But what are the implications of this monastic garb to you and to your life? Let me just mention some implications to give you an idea what I'm saying as you try to find out the implications of the monastic life to your own life, to your own self. What comes to mind now is the clerical attire. The attire of a cleric constitutes a sign that can and ought to attract all the members of the church in an effective and prompt fulfillment of the duties of their Christian vocation. You'll find this in the Constitution Lumen Gentium, Constitution of the Church. Number 44, and on the decree on bishops, Christus Dominus, number 35. So the clerical attire is a sign that ought to attract all the members of the church in an effective and prompt fulfillment of their duties of the Christian vocation. I remember when I was one of the assistant priests in Candon in the late 60s, it was 70, 71. We were 4 priests then. Father Morales was the parish priest. Father Peralta was the assistant. Father Cruzes was another one. All of them have already gone. And I was the 4th. They were in their mid-50s. I was just in my early 30s. And the Parish Pastoral Council, which meets regularly every month. And it was a beautiful council because all the barangays were represented. And in every barangay, Parish Pastoral Council meeting, there were over 100 attendants. And they wrote a letter addressed to us all, to Father Morales, Father Peralta, Father Cruzes, and Father Rabang. And the kernel of that letter was they were asking us to go around the parish with a distinctive sign to remind them of God, because as they said, in our workaday life, you are weak in faith, weak in hope, and weak in charity and love. And we need people to remind us of God and of the values of the gospel. And you are the ones, Reverend Fathers. Well, but it's unfortunate today that priests are moving around without any distinctive sign. It's not to proclaim yourself and to elicit whatever respect or attention. No. It is to remind all the members of the church in an effective and prompt way to fulfill the duties of their Christian vocation. Well, according to the CBCP, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, the proper clerical attires are cassock or religious habit. Of course, we don't go around now with the cassock or religious habit. But for official functions, yes. Second is the clergyman's suit. Well, it's too hot to be going around with the suit. Or maybe the third one is a little bit more tolerable. Trousers of dark one-tone color or white, and a shirt of one-tone color with a clerical collar or with a distinctive cross. The late John Paul II, who is now Saint John Paul II, insisted that, quote, in the modern secular city, where the sense of the sacred has so fearfully weakened, people need these reminders of God. Ecclesiastical garments induce us to reflection on the reality that we represent in the world and on the primacy of spiritual values which we affirm in human existence. Unquote. For the religious or consecrated persons, especially the religious sisters, the religious habit is a sign of consecration and a witness to poverty. And consecrated persons are to wear the habit of their institute determined by their own law. Of course, some sisters now, only very few, are going around with the secular dress, but with a cross. But that, I think, is not even acceptable to people. Now this is for you, lay. The implication of the monastic garb is modesty. Modesty. And modesty is one of the fruits of the Spirit, according to St. Paul in his letter to the Galatians chapter 5. What is modesty? Modesty is decency. Modesty inspires a person's choice of clothing. Modesty dictates a lifestyle which makes it possible to resist the allurement of fashions. You find this teaching in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, CCC, number 2523. I repeat, modesty is decency. It inspires a person's choice of clothing. It dictates a lifestyle which makes it possible to resist the allurement of fashion. Oh, it's horrible now, especially you women of these postmodern times. Modesty is one of the imperatives of the 9th commandment. an intuition of the spiritual judgment proper in a believer, especially in the wake of fashions advertised and solicited by the media to exhibit the intimate parts of the human body. Those are some of the implications of the monastic garb today. Now, in your own personal life, in your own life of modesty and decency, what, according to your honest, right judgment and conscience, what would be the implications of the monastic garb, which of course you do not wear, but somehow they must be manifested in your own life. This is all for this presentation. Stand by tomorrow at the same time for my talk on monastic investiture rites. Again, with the implications of these investiture rites today in your life as laymen and women, because you are just monks and hermits at heart. Externally, you don't wear the garments, the garb. Externally, you are not invested with the monastic garb. Stand by tomorrow at the same time, 10 o'clock in the morning. Goodbye now.